Today in episode 98, I'd like to provide a strategy for creating a student podcast. Hello and welcome. My name is Benjamin Stewart at benjaminlstewart.net. And today we're going to talk about a strategy that can be used for implementing in your student podcast. Before we get into today's topic, if you have any thoughts, comments, insights, or experiences regarding today's topic, feel free to reach out to me at my Twitter handle at BNLEEZ. So today I'd like to talk about using a strategy, something that we can think about and start implementing this spring 2022 semester. As we're creating our weekly podcast, I think using mind maps is going to help us think more critically about the information that we're trying to incorporate into our own podcast. Remember that each week as you're preparing for your podcast, a podcast that should be centered around an idea, a topic that is of interest to you, that's something that you're passionate about. It might be related to the major, might be related to teaching English as a second language, or it just might be something that you enjoy doing based on a hobby, just personal experiences that you've had, something that you enjoy learning more about. These are all possible topics that you can bring into your weekly podcast. As we've spoken about in class, you have an option here as we're beginning this spring semester to either continue the topic that you developed and discussed last semester, or you're free to choose a new topic if you wish. Okay, but the idea is to think about a topic that you want to stick with throughout the entire semester, something that you will not get tired of investigating and listening to other podcasts related to that topic, something that's going to draw your interest throughout the remaining part of the semester. So think about using mind maps. In fact, I'm going to ask that you start using mind maps in preparing for your weekly podcast. As you're submitting your weekly podcast, as we talked about in class, I'll ask also that you include a copy of your mind map. Now, the mind map can be something that you get online. I will include a PDF file with a lot of different types of mind maps that you are free to use. If you use your favorite search engine and just do a search for mind maps, you're going to find, especially if you click the image option, you should have plenty of examples of mind maps that you can incorporate into your own process as you're preparing for your podcast. But some of the different types of critical thinking that are probably going to be part of some of your podcasts include problem solution. You know, you could think about preparing a podcast that is based on a problem that you present first. You describe the what about the problem, the why, maybe the when, the where, the context of the problem, and then the remaining part of your podcast deals with the solution. Now, the solution can be, and or the problem can be information that you gathered from podcasts that you have been listening to, and you can bring those in. Remember that when you're using or creating your own podcast, that you need to reference those sources simply by mentioning the name of the podcast or the person or host of that podcast, so that you're not taking that idea as your own, that you're providing a reference there. So you'll need to include that when you're creating your podcast. But a problem solution is certainly a very common organizational pattern that you might incorporate into your own podcast. Another type of critical thinking might include a cause and consequence or cause and effect relationship. So again, you might begin by talking about what caused something else and trying to describe the relationship between that phenomenon. And the cause and or the effect can come from, again, your sources from your podcast. And, you know, when I mention try to include these sources, right, from other podcasts. That doesn't mean that you don't also want to offer your own opinion, your own perspective based on your knowledge and your own experiences, right? So when you're asked to link your ideas and try to get information from outside sources, this also means that you want to complement it with your own perspective. Another common organizational process, or not really, organizational pattern that you can follow, excuse me, is the process, right? The process of a phenomena. So first this happened, and then this happened. You might include dates. You might include a description of how one thing leads to another. Okay, so you could also think of it as kind of a chain relationship or a linking relationship. So this is linked to this. This second thing is linked to something else, and you move along, and that could be an organizational pattern that's most appropriate for your own podcast. Again, the description, the information that you're including in that discussion of the process is coming from outside sources. Again, the thing that I want to really focus on this semester is bringing in outside information and then reformulating that information, thinking critically about that, and then asking yourself, what's the best organizational pattern to follow for this particular podcast? It's not really trying to find the best organizational pattern and sticking to one throughout the semester. It really is dependent on the overall goal of that particular episode, that weekly episode. What's the intention? What is the objective that you're trying to that you're trying to communicate? And then finding the most appropriate organizational pattern that fits that objective. Another very important way to think about your podcast is to organize it by telling a story. Right? So think of maybe a personal experience that you can bring into your discussions, and through that presentation, through that act of telling a story, you're bringing in information from outside sources, from other podcasts, and then offering your own opinion. Remember that bringing in outside sources should, for the purposes of our podcast, come from other podcasts. That is, this is a listening and speaking exercise. Of course, you could also be reading information and bringing that in, but I would ask that you avoid actually reading and turn this weekly podcast exercise into a listening and speaking exercise. Okay, so again, try to rely only on information that you get from outside sources through other podcasts. This is where finding your own podcatcher is going to be very helpful, so that you're able to access that information from your mobile device. By just having your cell phone next to you, you'll have hopefully a lot of opportunities throughout the day to take a few minutes to listen to your favorite podcast as you're preparing and thinking about that week's podcast that you later will create. So problem and solution, cause and consequence, process, storytelling. Of course, there are many other organizational patterns, but these are four that come to mind that certainly that you could bring into your own podcast as you're creating a set of ideas in a coherent way to make a particular point. So when we're bringing in information from outside sources, we're basically synthesizing information. Okay, so remember that there is a close relationship between analysis and synthesis. So when you're listening to podcasts, whether you're doing it passively or you're sitting down listening and pausing the audio and taking notes, right? There is first a process usually of an analysis. So when you're listening to a podcast, you're writing down notes, you're writing out the key points, and you're thinking specifically of that one podcast about what is of interest to you, what could you use, what should you disregard. And you're probably following that same process as you're listening to other podcasts in order to gather information. You're essentially comparing and contrasting other sources as well to see if people agree, if they disagree, Why might they disagree? Why might they agree? Think of the question words, the what, the how, the why, the when, the where, with whom in your process of analysis. Again, the analysis is listening to one particular podcast and following a process of getting the most out of listening and understanding that one source, and then following a similar pattern as you're listening to other podcasts. Synthesis is then where you're combining separate elements or separate sources or various podcasts, different points of view, to form some kind of coherent whole, right? Think of it also as a reasoning from the general to the specific. Think of the point that you're trying to make for your podcast and follow kind of a deductive, logical reasoning to achieve the main point that you're trying to make. Think of also synthesis as a combination of a thesis, of a point of view, and an antithesis. Or maybe another way to look at it is a combination of a initial argument and a counter argument. Two sides of the debate. Think of a pro and a con, someone who's for something, someone who's against something, trying to talk about what it means to have these two opposing viewpoints. Okay, so there are many different ways of thinking of synthesis or trying to synthesize different pieces of information, but essentially this is what we're doing. We're combining an analysis and a synthesis and bringing outside sources into our own podcast. All right, so this is what I'd like for you to think about this semester as you're preparing for your podcast. Try to use some kind of visual strategy through mind maps. I'm going to ask that you try to include mind maps when you're submitting your weekly podcast, so you can upload your audio, you can upload your mind maps, and then I'm also going to ask that you try to include at least 2 sources, at least 2 different podcasts that you drew on in order to create your own weekly podcast. Of course, it could be more if you have more than 2. But this semester, I'm going to ask that you upload your audio, as we've talked about in class, a copy of your mind map, and probably in the mind map that it would be easier just to also state the name of the podcast, maybe the episode of the podcast, and try to include at least 2 sources, 2 different podcasts, and just list it in your mind map as a reference. This has been In the Classroom, an educational podcast making teaching and learning more transparent. Thanks for listening.